Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow. My name is Mariana Cordier, and I am your host. I am coming to you from my home via Zoom. February is Black History Month. 2020 and early 2021 have exposed the state of affairs of the struggle for equality, acceptance, and justice in this nation. The importance of acknowledging our history and using it as a teaching tool to advance unity and harmony has never been more important. The guests joining me today are Dr. Kim Nickerson. He's an African-American historian, Jason Green, a documentarian, Violetta Sharps-Jones from the Lakeland Community Heritage Project, and Gabriel Greaves from the Prince George's African-American Museum and Cultural Center. Thank you all for joining me. This is going to be such an exciting show. I wanted to kind of start with Dr. Nickerson because I love history and the importance of history. Why don't you share with me why Black History Month is so important?
You know, as an educator and someone who really tries to motivate students to take the most out of the education that is available to them here in our great state of Maryland, you often have to find motivating factors for students. And one of the greatest motivating factors that I found is to alert students to the greatness that is all around them, not only through history, but current greatness as well. And so what I try to do is I try to take students in the here and now, and I try to contextualize what they're experiencing, what they're going through, what the world and what this country is like now. And then I try to walk them backwards in time for them to see that there have been others that have come along the same way that they are now coming along, and that they've done well despite the obstacles in this country, because they're all invested and imbued with greatness. And so once again, connecting the history, the past with the present and the future is really important and symbolic, and it can be symbolized in the Sankofa bird of West African tradition. And so I see my work as trying to exemplify the best of the Sankofa tradition.
And Ms. Sharps-Jones, you have a fascinating story and history, being that you can trace your ancestors all the way back to when they got their freedom and came to settle in the Lakelands community in Prince George's County. How does that sharing that history impact, your kids, your grandkids, and those around you?
Oh, it impacts them tremendously. My family, as you said, it dates back to their move to Prince George's County from Westmoreland County, Virginia. And my great-grandparents, which were the first to come to Prince George's County and to Lakeland, came between 1890 and 1900. I'm a local historian and genealogist, and I've been involved with the Lakeland Community Heritage Project since it was established back in 2009. And the importance of it is that we want to be able to pass this on to the generations, my grandchildren and their children, because we realize that if we don't document the history of this African-American community, the history will be lost. And it certainly was a very important part of Prince George's County and Maryland's history. So for that reason, it can benefit many.
So Jason, you have the neat aspect of having taken history in Montgomery County and documented it and have, well, why don't you tell us about your documentary?
Thank you for having us, and wish that we could be in person doing this, but happy to be together in any fashion. So my story is actually quite similar to Ms. Sharps-Jones in that my family is able to chronicle our history in Montgomery County back into the middle of the 1800s. in coordination with the Pleasant View Historic Site, been able to trace my family's existence out of slavery into freedom, and their work in trying to establish the free community of Quince Orchard, starting again right after the Civil War, and sort of chronicling its persistence from the 1860s to now. You mentioned the documentary film. Our family also has the benefit of pioneers like Ms. Sharps-Jones, who have really taken on the effort to chronicle and document our history, but we had only shared it internally. And we hadn't taken the next step to really articulate and share that history with the world, with the broader community, to do what Dr. Nickerson was talking about, which is really to engage and inspire. And so I recently directed a documentary called Finding Fellowship, which is really the story of persistence, of survival, of how that African-American community ultimately merged with surrounding white communities to create this integrated community that's existed for the last 150 years, and how relevant that idea of coming together is even today.
Well, and that's a perfect segue of talking about today, because so much has gone on in the last year, in the last couple of weeks. Dr. Nickerson, how do you tell young people today, the importance of looking at, their history, Black history, and what's happening now?
We're in a very important time in the history of this country. We've just gone through a very fractious election where, by most accounts, this country had a president who was very hostile to African Americans, and we have to start with that. But we're also in the middle of what we're calling a Black Lives Matter movement that really chronicles our plaintive cry to the unnecessary killings, murders of African Americans at the hands of police officers. While at the same time, we just witnessed the inauguration that included the very first African American and Asian descent vice president, who happens to be the first female vice president of this country, and a tremendous piece of spoken word poetry by young Miss Amanda Gorham that has just really gripped the nation. So what's important for young people today? Amanda Gorham's not the first African-American poet to stir this country with words.
That's amazing that she
During
was
the Black
able-
Lives Matter movement, this is not the first time we've suffered it. If you read about Fannie Lou Hamer, you'll read about tremendous amounts of lynchings 100 years ago. And then this is not the first president that has been hostile to the humanity of people of African descent. So we can connect people with current events and the past quite easily today.
And I think the importance of maintaining this history to remind everyone the need for continuing in the campaign for equality and justice is just as important. And your work as maintaining the museum, African American history, Mr. Greaves, tell us a little bit about your museum.
So at the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center, our story really began in 1991 with the foundation of the North Brentwood Historical Society. In regards to that, the Historical Society was designed to undertake the creation of an oral history project, an exhibit entitled Footsteps from North Brentwood. That documented and celebrated the cultural heritage of the first municipality in Prince George's County that was incorporated by African Americans. And with that story, is not insignificant in any way, because when you consider what African Americans went through after the Civil War and how they developed land that was considered to not be the best quality, is a monumental achievement. So going back to how the museum was founded, in 1998, the Friends of North Brentwood was created to develop a museum for the town of North Brentwood, In the same year that the Gateway Community Development Corporation was established to foster development in the Gateway Arts District along Route 1 and Rhode Island Avenue. The former mayor of North Brentwood, Lillian K. Beverly, she was one of the key founders of the Friends of North Brentwood, and she pushed for the museum to develop. And then in 2007, Friends of North Brentwood, after they developed the organization, they changed their name to the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. And then one of my guests has a tour around Prince George's County, which is Dr. Nickerson. Isn't it your tour of the College Park area?
So about 7 years ago, actually, I developed a tour of the history of African Americans on the campus of the University of Maryland College Park. But you can't tell that history without understanding the Lakewood community or North Brentwood. Plug for me, I must say that I'm a longtime member of First Baptist Church North Brentwood. And I have other Montgomery County and Prince George's County bona fides as well. But the point is, people who lived in these counties that we're discussing, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, have contributed tremendously to what these counties are today. And my tour on the University of Maryland's campus is just one example of demonstrating that to the community. Of course, Mr. Greaves has just talked about his museum. Mr. Green talks about his documentary, which is important. And anyone who steps foot in College Park should understand about the Lakewood community.
Well, that's a perfect headway into Ms. Sharps-Jones. You know, talk about all the struggle that, you know, Lakeland has gone through, because urbanization was not Lakeland's friend.
Absolutely not. It was great to hear Mr. Greaves and Dr. Nickerson. All of your stories are so connected to the Lakeland story, and it encompasses the Route 1 corridor, which encompasses many African American communities along that Route 1, and all of them played a very important part, and their stories have been undertold completely. Lakeland was terribly interrupted by urban renewal in the 1970s. It took there were 140 homes in Lakeland, and 104 of them were removed by urban renewal. One of the good things that has come out of the current climate that we're in with Black Lives Matter and with all the political things that are going on is that Lakeland at least did get notification from the city of College Park in the form of asserting that they had a large part to do in the urban renewal process, and they're interested in doing restorative justice for Lakeland. So later on tonight, we will be talking to the city of College Park just about that. How do we do some form of restorative justice? Because the community was just totally disrupted. And as I stated before, it isn't just those families that were there present in the 1970s when urban renewal came. I fight for the families that came in the beginning. Those families that in some cases were born enslaved, or certainly their firsthand information from their parents and grandparents were that of slavery. And they were on the move to look for something, a better place to live, a better place to raise their kids. And they found their way to Prince George's County and to Lakeland, Maryland, and other communities. I'm so connected to North Brentwood. My dad was raised in North Brentwood. So much of my roots are there. You go along Route 1 and you talk about the communities of Merckert, Beltsville, Ammondale, Hyattsville, Melrose. We're all very, very connected. Lakeland had the high school from 1928 to 1950. All of those Black students had to come into Lakeland to go to school. Lakeland had 2 Rosenwald schools. Certainly the history of Lakeland needs to be told, mainly so that our children and children's children will know. We want a model of the history of Lakeland to be in the schools for the children, so they know. You have a school right in Lakeland, and the kids that go there don't have a clue that they're part of a historical community. That has to change. We have to do something to appreciate that history.
Jason, what do you think about what she was just commenting on?
One of the tenets that I'm hearing from Ms. Sharps-Jones, which is so relevant, is that this is history, but it's history that has a contemporary context to it. It continues to play out and have a lived experience today. And we see that throughout the Black community. I think about my own story, my own family. My grandfather's grandfather was born a slave in Montgomery County and lived in slavery until he was 33 years old. But that story got lost through our family down the generations. And so I grew up knowing who that ancestor's name, but not knowing his slavery story. I think you also know that I'm a current commissioner on the Montgomery County Commission on Remembrance and Reconciliation. It's our charge to look back at Montgomery County's history of lynching, and slavery, and that sort of undercurrent of mob rule. We saw that play out. Dr. Nickerson talked about what happened, what we saw on January 6th on the Capitol steps, the insurrection. It was that same kind of mob justice that we know, incited lynchings in our history. And so the reality here is that the history that we're talking about is not just in textbooks. It's not just in generations long ago. It's not just in deep South communities far from here. This is a history that existed in these communities in Maryland. It's a experience where the Black community has triumphed against odds after tribulation after tribulation. And we're seeing some of these themes reappear again. And so it's so important that we have the history to show who we are and remind us what we're capable of.
Is there anything you would like to add, Gabriel?
I would. One of the things I recall correctly is that North Brentwood was a sundown town. And I find that fascinating to me.
I'm sorry, for the audience that doesn't know, what is a sundown town?
A sundown town, historically, sundown towns were towns that were under laws, white supremacist laws, of course, that said that African Americans need to be at home and not on the streets by the time 6 o'clock hit. And if you were not at home, or if you did not obey the curfew, you were subject to murders, lynchings included. Let me speak from a young adult perspective real quick, just to make this more clear. What I find fascinating with the Black Lives Matters movement and several other organizations, whether it be CURE or Campaign Zero, all these organizations have been coming together because they are raising awareness on the ways that white supremacy never went away, just went undercover.
Yeah.
And in the Trump presidency, that we are all thankful to have removed, even though he is gone, the neighbors, the teachers, the doctors, the lawyers, the police officers, and everyone else that came above ground to support open white supremacy and racial terrorism, they didn't go away. They're still present. And so many people, even with a new president, a new administration, they are still fearful of the same things that historic towns like North Brentwood and many other towns within Prince George's County, they're still fearful of the things that our ancestors went through. And so it's really critical right now for people to connect the dots and to help young adults understand how these historic towns have stories of others who at one point were young adults. They were freedom fighters. They were in the 60s and the 30s and before, people that were fighting against the system. And when you see that, when you make those connections, you can help young adults today appreciate the need for understanding local African-American history. I know that during Black History Month, from what I've noticed, the tendency in many spaces is to talk about African-American history from a macro perspective. So you talk about major historical first that Black Americans did. But then you'll you'll drive downtowns that may seem like a sleepy town or a small town, have no idea how many freedom fighters were in that small town you just drove through. And that's really critical for me as a young adult, a young 34-year-old millennial, because I see so many young adults doing the work and they feel that they're by themselves, as if they're the only ones who have ever done this work. And they're trying to connect with older adults from previous generations who have those stories. That's why at the museum, we like to connect with others throughout the county who can carry these stories forward and help to reframe the conversation, as opposed to saying, well, it was just people from back in the day doing the work, and today it's just young people trying to raise noise. That's not the case. These are people carrying forward the legacy of civic activists from previous generations, people who know their history and have a voice, that intergenerational dynamic. I hope that made sense what I just conveyed.
Absolutely. And actually, that's the angle I was shooting for this show, to be a little bit different from typical Black History Month. But I want to touch on something that Dr. Nickerson said to me when I was talking to him about being on the show. And you talked about the big elephants in the room, and specifically that it's plural. What are the big elephants in the room, Dr. Nickerson?
Well, in my view, the big elephants in the room, as far as our history on this continent is concerned, the big elephants are, hundreds of years have passed, but we still are grappling with some of the same issues that we were grappling with years ago. And it really is incumbent upon us to have a real, truthful conversation about what this country is and what it has meant. And the easiest way for me to explain it to people is to take James Baldwin's words at heart. James Baldwin said, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." So when you look at the events that happened on the Capitol grounds a couple of weeks ago, and when you read people say, no, that's not who America is. Well, I argue that is who America is. That's what America has been in the past, and we're seeing it today. And until we have a truth and reconciliation about that history and pull it forward to the present so that we can really deal with it, then we're going to have challenges. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and you're going to get nowhere in therapy, trust me, if you're working with a client who refuses to look at the past. You're not going to get any therapeutic gains.
Right.
To heal ourselves as a nation, we still haven't healed ourselves. That's the big elephant in the room. Those are the big elephants in the room.
So Jason, how can we do this? How can we be better? How can we not let the white supremacy, slither back down into the rocks and really expose it and end it, or try to get over it?
This point that we're talking about, that concept of truth and reconciliation, often gets talked about, and I couldn't agree more with the doctor. The part that we often focus on is the reconciliation without the truth. And we need to spend time on that truth, on that remembrance, on that atoning, on that sitting with our uncomfortable past, right? Being in discomfort, acknowledging what our history has been, effectively calling a spade, and then we can begin to move forward. What we also need to realize is that we are not all going to move forward together. When you talk about how do we meet white supremacists, that's not our responsibility. We need to have an opportunity for significant truth telling, for people to embrace that truth and for us to move forward. We can leave the door open for those that are going to come along later, but we can't wait for those who are going to sit and hate and vile to correct themselves and come along. We need to recognize that we can open our arms wide enough for those who want to participate in that truth and reconciliation process, and move forward and root out those who aren't going to participate in that. There's okay to call that population out for what it is, and to speak truth to power, as Brother Greaves was talking about, calling it white supremacy, calling it that evil. I think that's critically important. One of the things that I want to share, it's one of the reasons that I made the documentary. I know we're going to be airing it in the Montgomery County community in February 23rd. So just want to give that plug for it as a tool. We use it as a means and a mirror for communities to look at, to see themselves, and to have some of these courageous conversations about the way in which we are going to move forward hopefully together.
I believe you're going to have the documentary aired at Black Rock, which is located in Germantown, but I believe, is it virtual?
That's right. We're going to have Black Rock and Docs in Progress and Pleasant View have come together jointly, and we'll be sponsoring a screening. I'll make sure that your viewers have a link. We really appreciate everyone tuning in.
That's awesome. And so we have just about a minute left. So Ms. Sharps-Jones, I give you the last minute, the last word.
Well, I just want to say one of the things that I think we can help is in continuing to tell the stories, and do that through documentation, do that through getting your grandchildren and younger children to interview elders, find out about their stories, document it, do the oral histories. Lakeland has been engaging for several years in doing gatherings where we've invited people in to bring their photographs, bring their documents, tell their stories, do the oral histories with them. And we're building a database so that this history that we have can be shared with anyone. You can just tap into certain family names, you can tap into a certain period of time, and therefore you will hear the story, the voices of the people of Lakeland and the surrounding neighborhoods. And that's what we need. We need not to forget. We need to tell our story, and hopefully that will improve things greatly.
Well, that's it. We're out of time. Thank you so much to my guests. I think it was a great show, and our audience for watching. Please watch us on our YouTube channel also, which is Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow's Show. And I'm Mariana Cordier. Until next week.